The morning air carried a sharp chill, the kind that nips at your ears and makes you pull your coat tighter without thinking. Outside the grand stone building of the Westmore Conservatory of Music, the sidewalk buzzed with energy. Students arrived in twos and threes, some alone, all dressed like they were stepping onto a stage before even reaching the audition room. Polished shoes clicked against the pavement. Designer bags swung from shoulders. Hair was perfectly coiffed, nails neatly done, and confidence radiated off them like heat from a sidewalk in July. Inside the lobby, the buzz grew louder. Laughter, quick chatter in half a dozen languages. The occasional burst of a scale played on a portable keyboard, just to warm up. Everyone seemed to know someone. Hugs were exchanged, last-minute tips shared, nervous jokes tossed around to ease the tension. It was a world of shared dreams, intense practice, and unspoken competition. Only the best would be chosen for the elite performance program, and today was the day that would decide who moved forward. Then, through the tall glass door, she walked in. She didn't make a sound when she entered. No dramatic pause, no sweeping glance around the room. She just stepped inside, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, and moved quietly toward an empty chair in the far corner. Her coat was old, the kind you'd find at a second-hand shop, functional, not fashionable. Her shoes had seen better days, scuffed at the toes, laces frayed just enough to notice if you were looking closely. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No curls, no shine, just plain and practical. She carried no fancy case, no sheet music in a leather folder, just a small worn notebook tucked under her arm and a thermos that looked like it had been refilled more times than anyone could count. No one greeted her. No one even glanced her way for more than a second. To the others, she was invisible. Just another person who must have wandered in by accident, maybe a parent waiting for their child, or someone lost on their way to another building. A few students nearby exchanged glances. One nudged his friend and whispered something that ended with a quiet chuckle. Another girl turned to her companion and said, just loud enough to carry, "Do you think she knows where she is?" She heard it. Of course she did. But she didn't react. She sat down, placed the thermos gently on the floor beside her, and opened her notebook. Her fingers traced over lines of handwritten notes, not music, but reminders. Breathe before you play. Don't rush the left hand. You belong here. Simple words written in careful script, like she'd needed to convince herself over and over again. Outside the conservatory's gleaming windows, the city moved on. Cars honked. People hurried to work, buses rumbled past, but inside time seemed to slow for everyone except her. While others paced nervously or ran through finger exercises on their knees, she stayed still. Calm. Grounded. Like she'd already made peace with whatever was about to happen. What none of them knew was that she'd been awake since 4 a.m. Not because of nerves, but because that's when the church basement unlocked. For the past 3 years, that's where she practiced, on an old upright piano with sticky keys and a pedal that groaned like an old man getting out of bed. The church let her use it for free as long as she helped tidy up afterward. She'd take the earliest bus across town, her fingers stiff from the cold, and play until her hands ached. Rain or shine, holiday or weekday, she showed up. No audience, no applause, just her and the piano and the echo of her own determination bouncing off concrete walls. She never had a private teacher. Couldn't afford one. Instead, she studied videos online, rewinding the same 10 seconds of a master pianist's performance over and over until her fingers could mimic the motion. She borrowed library books on music theory, underlining passages with a pencil so faint it could be erased and reused. She recorded herself on a cracked phone, listened back critically, and tried again. And again. And again. Most people would have given up. The odds were stacked against her. No connections, no money, no fancy training. But she'd grown up believing that music wasn't about how you looked or what you wore. It was about what you carried inside. And she carried something deep, a quiet fire that didn't need spotlights to burn. Back in the conservatory lobby, the names began to be called. One by one, students stood, smoothed their clothes, and walked toward the audition room with practiced poise. Each return brought either quiet relief or silent disappointment, but always attention. People leaned in to ask, "How'd it go?" Or, "What piece did you play?" There was camaraderie in the shared stress, even among rivals. When her name was finally announced, spoken plainly without fanfare, there was a beat of confusion. A few heads turned, scanning the room as if they hadn't noticed her before. Then, when they spotted her in the corner, a ripple of surprise passed through the group. Whispers started again, softer this time, but no less sharp. Her? Seriously? She's auditioning. She stood slowly, closed her notebook, and tucked it into her coat pocket. She didn't look at anyone, didn't adjust her clothes or check her hair. She just walked, steady, unhurried, toward the double doors of the audition room. Her steps were quiet on the marble floor, almost swallowed by the hum of conversation behind her. As she passed, one young man smirked and muttered to his friend, "Hope she doesn't break the piano." She didn't flinch, didn't pause, just kept walking. Behind those doors waited 3 judges, seasoned musicians with decades of experience, faces that had seen thousands of auditions, heard every trick, every flourish, every attempt to impress. They were tired, a little bored if they were honest. Most of the day had been technically perfect but emotionally empty performances, notes played correctly but without heart. They looked up as she entered. Their expressions didn't change much. One glanced at her application, then at her clothes, then back at the paper as if double-checking they hadn't misread something. Another tapped his pen against the table, already thinking about lunch. She walked to the grand piano in the center of the room, the kind with a glossy black finish that reflected the ceiling lights like a dark mirror. She paused for just a second, then sat on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, no one expected anything. But what they didn't know, what no one in that room could possibly guess, was that this plain woman in the faded sweater had spent years turning silence into song, loneliness into melody, and doubt into something beautiful, and in just a few moments, she would prove that the most powerful music doesn't come from perfection, it comes from truth. The room felt colder than it should have, not because of the temperature, central heating hummed softly in the background, but because of the weight of expectation, or rather, the lack of it. The 3 judges sat behind a long wooden table, papers neatly stacked, pens ready, faces neutral in that practiced way people develop after years of watching others try to impress them. They'd heard it all before, the flashy runs, the dramatic pauses, the pieces chosen specifically to show off speed over soul. Most of the day had blurred together into a polite routine of nods, scribbled notes, and quiet thank yous that meant next. When she sat at the piano, there was no flourish. No deep breath for show, no glance toward the judges to seek approval. She simply placed her hands on the keys, fingers resting lightly like they already knew the shape of what was coming. Her posture wasn't stiff or overly formal, just natural, as if she'd done this 1,000 times in rooms far less grand than this one. And in a way, she had. Outside the audition room, the lobby had quieted slightly. A few students still waited, but most were lost in their own thoughts, rehearsing silently in their heads. One girl absent-mindedly tapped rhythms on her knee. Another scrolled through his phone, though his eyes weren't really reading, just moving to pass the time. Then through the thick door, the first note rang out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. But it cut through the air like a thread of light in a dark room. Inside, the judges looked up. Really looked for the first time. The note hung in the space, clear and steady, followed by a second, then a third, weaving into a melody so tender it felt like someone whispering a secret you weren't meant to hear. It was a nocturne by a composer few had heard of, a piece buried in old archives, rarely performed because it demanded more feeling than technique. And that was exactly why she'd chosen it. The man in the center stopped tapping his pen. The woman on the left leaned forward slightly, her eyebrows lifting just a fraction. The third judge, who'd been glancing at his watch a moment before, now stared at the piano as if seeing it for the first time. Back in the lobby, the tapping stopped. The phone screen went dark. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Even the student who'd smirked earlier stood frozen, his arms crossed, mouth slightly open. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as if the building itself had taken a breath and held it. She wasn't playing for them. That was the strange thing. She wasn't playing to impress, to prove, or to win. She was playing because this music lived inside her, and if she didn't let it out, it would ache like a bruise that never heals. Her fingers moved with a kind of quiet certainty. No wasted motion, no exaggerated gestures. Every note had purpose. Every pause had meaning. The piece told a story, not with words, but with rises and falls, with silences that spoke louder than sound. It began softly, like footsteps in an empty hallway at night. Then it swelled not with volume but with emotion, like remembering something precious you thought you'd lost. There were moments of hesitation, as if the music itself was afraid to go on, and then moments of courage where it surged forward anyway. One of the younger students in the hallway closed her eyes. She didn't know why, but tears pricked at the corners. She hadn't even seen the player, just heard her, and already she felt like she knew her, like she'd been let into a room where someone was being completely, painfully honest. Inside the audition room, the judges exchanged glances, not the kind that said this is good, but the kind that said this is rare. The woman on the left quietly set down her pen. She didn't need to take notes. This wasn't something you could capture in shorthand. The music dipped again into a passage so delicate, it felt like watching a single leaf float down from a tree in autumn. And then, just when you thought it might fade away entirely, it rose again, stronger this time, full of resolve. Not angry, not desperate, just sure. Sure that beauty could exist even in broken places. Sure that someone who'd been overlooked could still have something worth saying. The student who'd laughed earlier now looked down at his shoes. He didn't feel clever anymore. He felt small. Not because he was bad, maybe he was very good, but because he realized in that moment that skill alone wasn't enough. You could have perfect timing, flawless scales, and still miss the heart of the music. And this woman, this quiet, plain woman in the old sweater, had found it. Time didn't just slow down. It bent. Minutes stretched like taffy. The clock on the wall ticked, but no one heard it. The city outside kept moving. Buses rolled, people shouted, life rushed on, but in that room everything else fell away. There was only the piano, the player, and the truth she was telling with every key she pressed. Her hands never shook now. The nervous tremor from before had vanished, replaced by a calm strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. She wasn't performing, she was sharing. And that made all the difference. When the final phrase began, the last few measures that would decide how the story ended, she didn't rush. She let each note breathe. Let them linger. Let them mean something. And when the last one finally came, soft and low, like a sigh after a long journey, she didn't lift her hands right away. She let them rest on the keys as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Then silence. Not the awkward kind, not the empty kind, but the kind of silence that follows something sacred, like the hush after a prayer or the stillness just before dawn. In the lobby, no one moved. No one clapped. They just stood there stunned, as if waking from a dream they didn't want to leave. The girl who'd cried wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed but not sorry. The boy who'd mocked her stared at the door like it might open and reveal something miraculous. Inside, the judges didn't speak right away. They just looked at each other, then at her, then back at each other. No one needed to say it. They all knew. This wasn't just an audition. It was a moment they'd remember for the rest of their lives. And she simply stood, gave a small, quiet bow, not to show off but out of respect for the music, and turned to leave. No smile, no proud stride. Just the same calm walk she'd used when she came in, but everything had changed. Because now, no one saw a plain woman in a faded sweater. They saw someone who carried a whole world inside her, and had just let them hear it. The last note hadn't even fully faded before the room began to shift. Not with noise, at first it was still too quiet for that, but with something deeper, something unspoken. The kind of quiet that comes after you've witnessed something real, something raw, something that cuts through all the noise of everyday life and leaves you standing a little straighter, feeling a little more human. Inside the audition room, the three judges sat frozen, not because they were unsure, but because they were overwhelmed. It wasn't just the notes she'd played, it was the way she'd played them. Like every key had a memory attached. Like every pause held a breath she'd been holding for years. One of the judges, a woman who'd spent 40 years listening to prodigies and perfectionists, felt her throat tighten. She'd heard technically flawless performances before, dozens, maybe hundreds, but never one that felt this honest. Never one that made her want to close her eyes and just listen, not as a critic, but as a person. The man in the center cleared his throat softly, more to ground himself than to speak. He glanced down at his notepad, but there was nothing useful to write. How do you score a performance that doesn't feel like a performance at all? How do you rate someone who didn't come to impress but to share? Outside in the hallway, the silence stretched a beat longer, then broke like a wave. Someone started clapping. Not loud at first, just a single pair of hands, hesitant, almost reverent. Then another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the whole lobby was filled with applause. Not the polite kind you give out of habit, but the kind that rises up because you can't help it. Because something inside you demands to be acknowledged. The student who'd whispered a joke earlier stood near the back, hands at his sides, not clapping. He wasn't being rude, he just couldn't move. He kept replaying those first few notes in his head, over and over, trying to understand how something so simple could feel so powerful. He'd practiced for years, paid for private lessons, worn the right clothes, said the right things. But in that moment, he realized he'd been playing for the wrong reasons. He'd been playing to be seen. She'd been playing because she had to. Near the front, a younger girl, maybe 16, still clutching her sheet music like a shield, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She'd been nervous all morning, terrified she wasn't good enough. But now, hearing what that woman had done with just a piano and her truth, she felt something shift inside her. Not jealousy, not insecurity, hope. Because if someone like her, plain, quiet, overlooked, could walk into this room and leave everyone speechless, then maybe there was room for people like her too. The door to the audition room opened slowly. She stepped out, eyes down, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She hadn't expected applause, hadn't prepared for it. For a second, she looked startled, like she'd walked into the wrong room. Then she saw the faces, some tearful, some awestruck, some ashamed, and she understood. She gave a small nod, not a bow, just a quiet acknowledgement, and moved toward the exit. But no one let her pass unnoticed. One student stepped forward, not to stop her, but to say, "That was incredible." His voice cracked a little, like he hadn't meant to speak at all, but the words had pushed their way out anyway. Another whispered, "Thank you," as if she'd done them a personal favor. She didn't reply with grand words or a humble brag. She just smiled, small, genuine, and kept walking. Not because she was shy, but because the music had already said everything she needed to say. Back in the audition room, the judges finally found their voices. "She's not just good," the woman said, her voice softer than usual. "She's necessary." The man who'd been checking his watch earlier shook his head slowly. "I've heard Chopin played by concert pianists in Vienna, but I've never heard it feel like that." They didn't need to deliberate. There was no debate. Some things are just clear when you hear them. Meanwhile, word spread fast. A student recorded the last 30 seconds on their phone. Not the whole piece, just enough to capture the hush that followed. They posted it to a music forum with the caption, "You won't believe who just walked in." Within an hour, it had hundreds of shares. People asked, "Who is she? Where did she study? Is this real?" No one knew, and that made it even more powerful. Because in a world where everything is polished, packaged, and posted for likes, here was something untouched by performance. No filters. No backstory crafted for sympathy. Just a woman, a piano, and a lifetime of quiet dedication finally given a moment to speak. Later that afternoon, as the conservatory emptied out, one of the janitors, a man who'd worked there for 20 years and seen thousands of students come and go, was cleaning the audition room. He ran his hand over the piano lid, then paused. He'd heard the performance from the hallway. He didn't know music theory, couldn't name a single composer. But he knew what it felt like to be ignored, to work hard without anyone noticing. And when he heard her play, he'd stopped mopping and just listened, leaning against the wall like he was back in his grandmother's kitchen, hearing her hum old songs while stirring soup. He didn't say anything to anyone, but that night he told his granddaughter about it. "Sometimes," he said, "the right person shows up at the right time, and they don't need fancy clothes or a big name. They just need to be true." Back at the church basement, she returned to her usual routine. The piano still groaned. The light still flickered. But something had changed. Not in the room, in her. She hadn't played for fame. Hadn't played to prove a point. She'd played because the music wouldn't let her do anything else. And now, whether anyone remembered her name or not, she knew she'd done it right. She sat down at the old upright, placed her fingers on the keys, and played a simple scale, just to feel the wood under her skin, the vibration in her bones. Outside, the city buzzed on, unaware of what had happened that morning. But in that quiet basement, the air still hummed with the echo of something real. And that was enough. The applause didn't stop the moment she left the room. It followed her like a quiet echo, bouncing off the marble walls and trailing behind her as she walked down the hallway. But she didn't turn around. She didn't look for approval or wait for someone to tell her what she already knew in her bones. She had played her truth, and that was enough. Outside, the afternoon sun had softened, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. The city felt different now. Not louder or brighter, but somehow more alive, as if it had been holding its breath all morning and had only just remembered how to breathe. She zipped her coat, tucked her hands into her pockets, and started walking toward the bus stop. The same one she'd stood at hours earlier in the cold dark. Back inside the conservatory, the mood had shifted completely. The tension that had hung in the air all day, the kind that comes from competition and fear of failure, had melted away, replaced by something rare: humility. Students who had spent the morning sizing each other up now spoke in hushed tones, not about who played fastest or cleanest, but about what they'd just heard. One young man sat on a bench staring at his hands like they'd betrayed him. "I've been practicing for 10 years, he said quietly to no one in particular. "And I've never made anyone feel anything." A group of girls huddled near the water fountain, replaying the moment the first note rang out. It was like she wasn't even in the room anymore, one said, like she was somewhere else and we just got to peek in. Even the faculty noticed the change. A piano instructor who'd been grading audition scores in her office stepped into the hallway after hearing the commotion. She didn't see the performance, but she saw the faces of her students, softened, stunned, some still blinking back tears, and she knew something unusual had happened. She asked what piece was played. When they told her, she nodded slowly. "That's not a piece you choose to show off," she said. "That's a piece you choose when you have something to say." Meanwhile, the judges remained in the audition room long after the schedule said they should have moved on. They weren't discussing technique or repertoire. They were talking about presence, about how music isn't just sound, it's soul. The woman judge, the one with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that had seen generations of musicians come and go, finally said what they were all thinking. We spend so much time looking for perfection. We forget to listen for humanity. And that's exactly what they'd heard. By evening, the story had spread beyond the conservatory walls, not through headlines or press releases, but through word of mouth, the oldest and most honest kind of sharing. A student told their roommate. A teacher mentioned it in class. Someone posted a short, shaky audio clip online with no caption, just the label "Westmore Audition Unknown Pianist." Within hours, people were asking, who was she? Where did she come from? Was she a professional hiding in plain sight? But no one had answers. No flashy social media profile. No manager. No backstory crafted for sympathy or clicks. Just a woman who showed up, played from the heart, and walked away without looking back. That night, in a small apartment above a laundromat on the other side of town, she heated soup on a stove with 2 working burners and one that sparked if you turned it too far. She ate alone, like always, but not lonely. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. She didn't check her phone. There were no messages, no missed calls. She hadn't given anyone her number. She hadn't stayed to talk to the judges or pose for photos. She'd done what she came to do. Later, she sat by the window with her notebook open, not writing music, just thoughts. "They listened," she wrote. "Not to my clothes, not to my story, just to the music." She underlined that last word twice. She didn't know it yet. But her performance had already begun to ripple outward in ways she couldn't imagine. The next morning, a high school music teacher played the audio clip for her class. "This," she told her students, "is what happens when you stop trying to impress and start trying to connect." One student, a quiet boy who always sat in the back and never raised his hand, stayed after class. "Do you think," he asked, voice barely above a whisper, "someone like me could ever do that?" The teacher smiled. "Someone like you just did." At the conservatory, the student who'd mocked her found himself standing outside the church she practiced in. He didn't go in, didn't knock. He just stood across the street for a few minutes, watching the stained glass windows glow in the afternoon light, then turned and walked away. But something in him had changed. He canceled his next lesson with his expensive private coach and signed up to volunteer at a community music program instead. Even the judges couldn't shake what they'd heard. Days later, during a faculty meeting about admissions, one of them said, We talk about talent, but what if we've been missing the point? What if the real gift isn't how fast someone can play, but how deeply they can feel? No one argued. Back at the church basement, she returned to her routine. The piano still had sticky keys. The heater still rattled. But now when she played, she didn't just hear the notes, she felt the weight of what they could do. How they could reach people. How they could remind someone they're not alone. One afternoon, as she finished practicing, a little girl peeked through the doorway. Maybe 8 or 9, wearing mismatched socks and holding a recorder like it was a treasure. My mom said I could listen if I was quiet, she whispered. She smiled and patted the bench beside her. You can do more than listen, she said. You can try. And in that moment, the circle began again, not with fame or applause, but with one person offering what they love to another who's just learning how to hope. Because real impact isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a single note played with honesty, and as powerful as the silence that follows. Years passed, as they always do, quietly, steadily, like pages turning in a book no one's watching. The conservatory audition faded into memory for most, tucked away like an old photograph in a drawer. Students came and went, new faces replaced old ones, and the grand piano in the audition room played host to countless performances, each one chasing something: approval, fame, a spot on a prestigious list. But every now and then, someone would mention that day. A teacher would bring it up in class. A nervous auditionee would hear the story and ask, was she really that good? And someone would always answer, better. She was real. She never returned to the conservatory. Not for a follow-up interview. Not for a special performance, not even to collect a letter they'd sent her. Accepted, of course, with a full scholarship and a personal note from the head of the department. She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a shoebox under her bed, next to concert stubs from free community recitals, and a dried flower from the little girl who'd first peeked into the church basement. Instead of walking through gilded halls, she stayed where she'd always been, in that basement, with its flickering lights and groaning piano, teaching anyone who showed up with a love for music and nowhere else to go. No fees, no auditions, just open doors and open hearts. Kids from the neighborhood came after school, some dragging battered keyboards, others just eager to press a key and hear what happened. She taught them scales, yes, but more importantly, she taught them to listen, not just to the notes, but to themselves. One of those students was a girl with bright eyes and restless fingers who couldn't sit still for more than a minute, until she touched the piano. She'd been told she was too much everywhere else, too loud in class, too fidgety at home, too dreamy to be practical. But here in this basement, her energy became music. She practiced relentlessly, not for trophies, but because it made her feel whole. And when the time came for her to audition at the very same conservatory where her teacher had once played, she didn't wear fancy clothes or carry expensive sheet music. She wore her favorite sweater, the one with the loose thread she never fixed, and tucked her score into a folder made from recycled cardboard. The day of her audition, the lobby looked much the same, polished, tense, full of students trying to project confidence. But when her name was called, something shifted. Maybe it was the way she walked, not with swagger, but with quiet certainty. Maybe it was the way she sat at the piano and took a breath before playing, just like someone had once shown her. Or maybe it was the piece she chose, the same nocturne, the one rarely played, the one that asked for more heart than hands. When she began to play, the room fell silent, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. The judges leaned forward. Students stopped fidgeting. Even the air seemed to still. It wasn't identical to the original performance, how could it be? But it carried the same spirit, honest, unguarded, full of feeling. And when she finished, there was that same sacred pause, that breathless moment where no one dared move for fear of breaking the spell. Afterward, as she walked out, one of the younger auditionees stopped her. That was beautiful, they said. Who taught you? She smiled, small and warm. Someone who believed music isn't about being seen. It's about being true. Back in the church basement that evening, the piano waited, keys worn smooth from years of use. She sat down not to practice, but just to play, softly, slowly, like a lullaby for the day. Outside, the city hummed with its usual noise, cars, chatter, the distant wail of a siren. But inside, there was peace. She never became famous, never went viral in the way the internet measures success. No headlines, no interviews, no spotlight. But her impact grew in the quietest, most lasting way, through the students who carried her lessons into the world. One became a music therapist playing for patients in hospitals. Another started a free after-school program in a neighborhood with no arts funding. And the girl who'd auditioned at the conservatory? She got in, of course. And on her first day, she left a note on the piano in the main hall. For the woman who taught me that music doesn't care what you wear, it only cares if you mean it. No one knew who it was from, but those who remembered that long-ago audition knew exactly who it meant. Years later, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, an elderly man shuffled into the church basement, leaning on a cane. He didn't say much, just stood in the doorway for a while, watching her teach a group of children how to harmonize. When the lesson ended, he approached. "I was there," he said simply. "At the audition." I laughed. "I'm sorry." She looked at him, not with anger, but with kindness. "You were human," she said. "That's all any of us are." He nodded, eyes glistening, and left without another word. But the next week he came back, with a check to fix the church's heating system and a promise to help with repairs. He never mentioned the audition again. He didn't need to. Her life never became a movie. There were no dramatic twists, no sudden riches, no grand redemption arc. Just a woman who loved music, shared it freely, and changed lives without ever trying to. And maybe that's the most powerful story of all. The one that doesn't shout but stays. Because in a world that often confuses visibility with value, she proved that you don't need a spotlight to shine. You just need to show up, be honest, and play your truth. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone will listen and be changed forever. And somewhere in a quiet room with a worn piano and flickering light, she played on. Not for applause, not for fame, but because the music was still there waiting to be heard.